Parks Victoria acknowledges traditional owners throughout Victoria and pays respect to their culture and elders past, present and future. This episode of Closer to Nature was recorded at Mount Mackay in Alpine National Park, which forms part of highly significant cultural landscapes for traditional owners, and in Hepburn Regional Park on Dja Dja Wurrung country. Parks Victoria respects the deep and continuing connection that traditional owners have to these lands and waters of Victoria, and we recognise their ongoing role in caring for country.
Deep under the rocky boulder plateau of Mount Mackay, a tiny marsupial is sleeping during the coldest months of the year.
It's a small animal, probably about the size of a small fist. It's got grey-brown fur on its head, back and sides, and then it's pale brown and creamy on its chest. It's got a scaly, sparsely haired tail that's longer than the head and body combined, and it's what they call a prehensile tail, so it curls up at the end and it can be used to grab hold of things. They've got small feet, but they've got what they call opposable thumbs, so two thumbs opposite each other, and they can use those thumbs to grip on things like the bogong moth when they're feeding. And they weigh between 35 grams and 80 grams, so quite small, very small. But having said that, it's actually the largest of the 5 species of pygmy possum that we have in Australia.
This is Elaine Thomas. She leads ranger teams in the Victorian Alps. The very cute, very small, bright-eyed creature she's describing is Australia's very own mountain pygmy possum. For our dry, warm continent, this hibernating snow dweller is one of our strangest and most adorable creatures. Welcome to Closer to Nature, a Parks Victoria podcast that dives into the wonderful creatures and places that exist across Victoria's parks and reserves, the impacts a changing climate is having on them, and what we can do to help. I'm Dr. Mark Norman, Chief Scientist, Conservation and Climate Action at Parks Victoria. In this episode, we'll look at how everything in nature is linked, how animals, plants, fungi, all sorts of living creatures are all connected and really vulnerable to things like changing weather patterns or other pressures, and that these, especially through climate change, can impact some of our most precious species.
All right, so we're actually in the Falls Creek Alpine Resort on top of Mount Mackay.
Elaine is a program coordinator with Parks Victoria based at Mount Beauty in the Victorian Alps. We're talking to her from one of the highest elevations in Victoria, where mountain pygmy possums live.
Everything we can see around us is part of the Alpine National Park. So we can see as far out as Mount Bogong, which is the highest mountain in Victoria.
We're standing in the Alpine National Park, a huge 500,000 hectare park that protects the bests of the Victorian Alps. It rolls out beneath us almost as far as we can see. This part's known as the Bogong High Plains, and you'll be hearing the word bogong again later, but instead for a very important insect.
We're looking at what we call alpine and subalpine areas, and alpine areas are defined as areas with no trees. So, so they're at high elevation, and trees can't grow there because the temperature doesn't reach an average of 10 degrees throughout the whole year. So trees are unable to grow there. So Mount Bogong over there is what you would describe as true alpine, and then a lot of what we're seeing here is really subalpine, which is mainly the snow gum overstory, and then you might have a grassy understory or shrubby understory.
Alpine areas in Australia are very rare, representing just 0.3% of the total area of Australia. They contain unique and precious animals and plants found nowhere else on Earth. This is where mountain pygmy possums call home. Like many species and habitats around the world, this tiny possum is vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate and doesn't have a lot of other places to go. Species that have adapted to a very specific environment are most often the ones at highest risk. If you're thinking possum, you're probably thinking possums in the trees, possums in your backyard, possums taking fruit from your fruit trees, but you'd be wrong. This special little guy kicks all the possum rules and instead lives on the ground, among piles of rocks known as boulder fields, between special trees called mountain plum pines. The mountain pygmy possum is very different to its warmer relatives. It's happiest in the cold and is perfectly adapted to life in the freezer.
So in the past, the Ice Age, when the temperature was much cooler further around, the distribution was much wider. But as the temperature has increased, the pygmy possums have had to retreat up the hill to areas that still have the conditions that they like. So that it is confined to southeastern Australia and the alpine and subalpine areas. So that's areas above 1,200 metres elevation. But it's found in Victoria and New South Wales. And in Victoria, it's found in the Alpine National Park. So there's a number of small populations in the area that we can see on the Bogong High Plains and Mount Bogong. And then it also occurs near Mount Hotham between Mount Locke and Mount Higginbotham, in the Falls Creek Alpine Resort, and also at Mount Buller. But then in New South Wales, it's also found in Kosciuszko National Park. So in New South Wales, it occurs in an area of 8 square kilometres, and then in Victoria, it's restricted to about 2 square kilometres.
Out of an entire planet, that's a really tiny space to call home. The population numbers are quite small.
In total, there's about 2,000 individuals left in the wild, but they're spread between one population. There's multiple smaller populations. I think there's like 50% of the animals in Victoria and 50% in New South Wales. And of the ones in Victoria, there's 70-odd% occur in this area around here. So you might have up to 500 in some of those big populations, but they are generally quite small populations.
Small populations of mountain pygmy possums are spread across these alpine areas, isolated from one another. This adds another layer to their conservation challenges. These tiny mammals live in the crevices of boulders. If you look across the sparse alpine landscape and you see a group of boulders at an elevation above about 1,300 metres, there's a chance there's mountain pygmy possums living there. This is because those crevices are perfect places to live during the harsh conditions of winter.
So in a good winter, this area is blanketed in snow, so it's white as far as the eye can see. When the snow falls, the pygmy possums hide in their boulder fields under the snow and they take a big nap or go into what they call torpor, which is, they slow down their heart rate, their breathing, their metabolism, because there's not much food available other than what they've stored through the spring and the summer and autumn. The snow falls and then because of the rocks and the shrubs, the snow doesn't get all the way to the ground. So there's natural spaces then become lots of natural tunnels and things that they can move through and live in. And then the other thing about it is that blanket of snow is like a blanket and it provides good insulation for the possum from the outside temperature.
In alpine areas all around the world, many animals cope with having no food when the snow and ice comes in by hibernating. This is where they save their energy by having special long sleeps. Their body slows down, they use very little oxygen, very little energy, and don't need to eat. Mountain pygmy possums do their own version, known as semi-hibernation. It's probably a bit like sleepwalking. They doze, they slowly move around, they can even have snacks of stored food. All occurring in these under-boulder mini caves and tunnels, all under the ice. You can think of these as a smaller version of what, say, grizzly bears do in North America when they hibernate in caves over the winter. During this deep sleep, the possum will lose more than half its body weight. That's really hard for an animal that's pretty small to start with. So the immediate priority when they wake up is food, and they'll even start by eating their own mattress, their plant bedding. If every winter is a food-free snore fest, then the priority when you emerge is to get as fat as possible, find a mate, raise kids, get stores in before the next winter sets in. First, they've got to get fat, and this requires pigging out on really fattening, nutritious food. And the two foods they need are right there. Fat-filled bogong moths and the nutritious berries of the mountain plum pines.
The bogong moths is the big niche part of their survival, and so that's why, the survival of bogong moths is tightly linked to the survival of mountain pygmy possums.
For hundreds of thousands of years, huge swarms of bogong moths travel halfway across Australia each year to spend their summers in the cool Australian Alps. They've built up their body weight and come full of fat to live off as they prepare to lay their eggs in the autumn.
And the bogong moths come here in the spring and the summer because it's cooler than where they breed and are juveniles, which is in far western Queensland and New South Wales.
These moths make the ideal food for hungry pygmy possums, but the timing has to be perfect. Pygmy possums have to emerge from their long sleeps around the same time as the moths arrive en masse and the plums ripen.
They need the bogong moths to provide them with the energy that they need to produce and to feed their young. All right, well, it started to rain. We're having one of our lovely summer thunderstorms, so we've just jumped in the car. So if under climate change, the winter might finish early, so the pygmy possum will wake up early, and instead of having the bogong moths there ready to eat, they might have appeared, which means that the pygmy possums will have less energy to breed, which means they might produce less young. That will cause a population decline. Same thing with mountain plum pine, because it's warmed up and the seasons have changed. The plum pines might not flower at the right time for pygmy possums to be able to eat their fruit.
The researchers studying these unique marsupials are finding strains and breaks in the chains that make this whole system work. In bad drought years, bogong moth numbers have crashed, they've just stopped turning up. This drew urgent action from those that care. At times, bogong moths number in the billions and have blacked out the sky during their migrations to the Alps. In the spring, they'd emerge from huge swarms in Queensland and New South Wales to fly hundreds of kilometres to the Bogong High Plains. At the 2000 Sydney Olympics closing ceremony, they caused an absolute panic because a swarm came to the stadium lights and they thought it was a rain cloud. Another time they settled on Parliament House in Canberra and clogged all the air vents and filled all the awnings with these masses and masses of small moth. Researchers are trying to understand what causes these crashes in bogong moth numbers, and some of the candidates are things like drought, which definitely has an effect, or light pollution from cities, or even what happens when they're in the earliest life cycle stages on the farming lands in New South Wales and Queensland. But it's not all doom and gloom. Sometimes the unpredictability of the changing climate can turn things around. While overall bogong moth numbers are declining, the past 3 cooler and wetter La Niña years have helped moth numbers and thus helped the mountain pygmy possums.
I've seen it as well, where they're completely overlapping and then can completely cover the surface of rocks. Somewhere like this, Mount Mackay has a big population of bogong moths, and the air will just be buzzing with bogong moths flying around. And pygmy possums have 2 thumbs that oppose each other, and so what they do is they use those thumbs to hold the bogong moth, and then they take the wings off, and then they eat the abdomen, which is really rich in fat and protein. The feedback I'm getting from people who've been here and some of the researchers, and they've certainly talked about declining numbers.
For the possums, bogong moths and these alpine ecosystems, it's all about buying time and building the best strategies.
There's still a lot of work to be done there. One of the main things that's being done is there's a citizen science project where the Zoos Victoria have created a thing called the Moth Tracker.
Zoos Victoria's Moth Tracker website is a great idea and is easy to use. All you need to do is take a photo and log when and where you see a bogong moth. Then you send it off, and all this information helps researchers track the moth's location and their migration patterns. And it's not just the mountain pygmy possums that benefit. These moths are also vital food for many other animals across Australia, including bats, ravens, bush rats, even native fish. Moth numbers and timing of seasons are not the only challenges for mountain pygmy possums. Another is the spread of an invasive weed.
We've got one species here, which is the grey sallow willow. Willows were introduced to Australia in the 19th century, first as ornamental plants, then they were later planted to help stabilise riverbanks. But they arrived up here in the high plains after the 2003 fires. There were clouds of seeds came up here and they get trapped in amongst the gaps in the boulder fields. And then there might be enough soil there for it to take root. And then the roots grow down and they've got a really extensive root system. So the roots will grow through all those crevices and then they'll grow fat and end up filling the crevices. So then there's no more room left for the pygmy possum to run through there or to sleep or build their nests in those crevices. So, the pygmy possums get pushed out of their home. And then willows are also faster growing, much faster than some of the native vegetation. So that gets out-competed. So it'll outcompete the mountain plum pine, which again causes a loss of food for pygmy possums. And then they've got those small populations that often don't mix, so then they can inbreed, or, you've got a loss of genetic diversity, which can also result in declines in the population.
To tackle this problem, Parks Victoria has set up a willow control program.
We move through the different boulder fields and we go in and we cut the willows down and then paint poison on their stems, or we might spray them. That happens annually.
Our little mountain pygmy possums are also vulnerable to invasive predator species, foxes and feral cats. Each year we lead a fox baiting program to help protect them.
So we'll bury a poison bait. And, foxes are curious animals. They'll come and see disturbance. They'll check it out, find a piece of meat that they'll either eat or cache and eat later. And then places like the resorts also do some shooting of foxes. Cats is very challenging to deal with. We haven't got a technique that allows us to do the work in the park, but in resorts where you've got buildings and people where cats and that are sort of more used to people, and they've been quite successful with trapping and shooting for cats.
The lives and challenges of mountain pygmy possums are just one of the many examples of how species in nature are often dependent on each other for survival. When part of this intricate chain is broken, lots of other species and systems are affected. From here, let's go to the other end of the size spectrum and talk about a group of species that's vital for most animals that live on land, including us. These giant creatures can reach more than 100 metres high, and without them, we simply would not survive.
So most of my work is focused on forest health in the form of forest productivity and persistence. So I'm really interested in trees and their health and their growth and how that contributes to carbon stored in forests. I'm Elaine Bennett. I'm a Principal Research Fellow in the School of Agriculture, Food and Ecosystem Sciences at the University of Melbourne.
I'm here with Lorraine, surrounded by trees, to talk about what's happening to forests just like this one.
We are in the Hepburn Regional Park near Tipperary Springs, just to the west of Daylesford. We are on the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, paying our respect to them. We're sitting in what we would call a mixed species eucalypt forest. So that's a forest that's dominated by different types of eucalypts, different types meaning eucalypts that have stringy bark or box bark or gum bark. It's what we call a fire-tolerant forest, so forests that can re-sprout after fire. I don't think the fire has been through this part for quite some time now. You can tell that by all the wood that's on the ground that's not burned. There's not much evidence of fire scars or anything like that, so it could be decades, but I don't know. We can have any numbers of different types of fires through here.
In this country, fire is an integral part of forest life. But before we talk about that, let's talk about why forests and the trees in them are so important. It's all about what they create as habitats and the special thing they do with carbon dioxide, the gas that we both breathe out, like all animals do, and release when we burn wood or fossil fuels. It's all connected to a changing climate.
So we start with trees or just plants more generally. Obviously, they are the lungs of the planet. Through photosynthesis, they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and release oxygen, really important to life. In terms of forests and woodlands, trees are the backbone of forests and woodlands. They're not a forest or a woodland if the trees aren't there. They provide the foundational structure for that woody ecosystem. So they provide the microclimate for all the understory plants. So the trees form the overstory, then we have, a lot of diversity in the understory in shrubs and grasses. Those shrubs and grasses rely on the trees to provide the variability in microclimate and habitats. But they also obviously then provide a range of habitats for all sorts of animals, from every type of insect to reptiles to birds. And by definition, arboreal mammals rely on trees for their habitat and their resources.
We're talking here about the more tree-climbing relatives of our tiny mountain pygmy possum, species like the brush-tailed and ring-tailed possums, and their gliding relatives ranging from the tiny feather-tailed glider to the majestic greater glider. Trees are the essential ingredient here.
So they're regulating the climate, they're providing the resources through photosynthesis for all sorts of dependent organisms. So that's really important. So trees are the backbone of forests. They're important in terms of our well-being, but they're also culturally significant for many First Nations peoples throughout the world. Many cultural practices revolve around forests, including cultural burning practices. So human well-being just when you sit in a forest. But then also globally, forests are just a really significant part of the terrestrial carbon, so the land-based carbon stores of the world. So as an example, forests estimated to remove about 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide emissions annually on the planet. So just really important for that function of climate regulation. There are many other benefits. So obviously there's benefits associated with soil, keeping our soils intact through deep rooting systems, so preventing erosion, so buffering water quality. So Melbourne's water is really good naturally because we have forests in our catchments that act as a filter of the water supply.
As I said earlier, they're really important. But changing environmental conditions due to climate change are having a huge impact on forests and trees. Regular and longer intervals of hot weather, drier conditions, decreasing rainfall and moisture availability are all impacting areas like Hepburn Regional Park and the trees in this landscape.
They can be quite tolerant of slightly hotter, slightly drier. We're not sure how they'll go with hotter plus drier in the future. So there's the direct effects of climate change, but there's also indirect effects, and that is how climates are influencing disturbance regimes. So fire regimes in particular, because they're the largest kind of disturbance in these landscapes. So they are being, again, influenced by changing fire. What we're most concerned about there is more frequent and more severe fire. So these forests have evolved with quite regular bushfire, so that's unplanned or uncontrolled fire. Maybe every 5 to 20 years of moderate sort of intensity, we would say. So more intense can lead to more severe. And when we say severe, we mean negative potential impacts on the forests.
But how do eucalypts survive these fires?
In terms of the main adaptations that our trees have to fire, they sort of break up generally into cedars and resprouters. So cedars are those where the mature plants are killed by most fires of, say, moderate to high intensity. But then they drop their seeds onto an ash bed and regrow effectively. So an ash bed is rich in nutrients and carbon and things like that, and it's clear of other plants like grasses and shrubs. But those seedlings are vulnerable to death from the next fire. So if we get more frequent fire, they will be wiped out and we might get less regeneration, as well as maybe injuring the established trees.
So the challenge for cedars is you need long enough between fires for the next generation to grow up and make the next set of seed.
We have sort of iconic forests in Victoria, the mountain ash and alpine ash forests of the more mountainous country to the east of us in Victoria. They are highly productive forests, and they've evolved with fire regimes of intense fire, but not very often, maybe every 80 to 100 years. They get killed, the mature trees get killed by intense fire, but they've evolved to drop seed onto the ash bed and so have a new forest growing effectively after the fire. If we get more frequent fire though, those new plants don't have time. So if they have another fire within 20 years, they don't have time to grow up to reproductive maturity, so the seed isn't there. So there's no seed to follow that second fire. And what we've seen across parts of Victoria is tall forests like that being replaced by shrublands, dominated by acacias.
For resprouters, it's completely different.
These trees resprout from their stem and their main branches. So after a fire, you see, black stems clothed in green material. That's the epicormic sprouts coming out. So the buds, or the meristematic tissue that lead to the buds, is protected by the stem during the fire, and they regrow after the fire. So it's really extraordinary to see. When you think a forest has been devastated by fire, you come back 2 months, 3 months, sometimes 6 months later, and it's sheathed in green. So that can be from the main stem or it can be from the branches, but it can also be from the base of a stem. But what we're seeing is less successful resprouting, so less of it, or that the canopy is reduced much more by the fire and you get much simpler, narrower canopies than, the broad ones that we're seeing here. So they become less complex. They have fewer fire-adapted traits and there might be more mortality, they might be more restricted in their range. They can resprout, but they're weak resprouters. They're not that great at reseeding after fire.
So not all trees are alike, and not all forests are alike. Some forests do better in fire than others. Many Australian trees, particularly eucalypts, have evolved to survive fires. But even eucalypts haven't evolved to survive the increasing frequency, intensity and extent of bushfires, such as what we saw in the 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfires. These catastrophic fires burnt 1.5 million hectares here in Victoria and around 15 million hectares across eastern Australia. We're seeing these areas in our parks, areas where the eucalypts are no longer replacing themselves, and we're seeing these patches on the landscape that are known as collapsed forests or landscape traps. And this is where, unless we help, there will be no eucalypts and no complex forest in those areas. So what can we do? How can we help them persist and flourish?
First of all, in terms of protecting trees, we need to protect trees as much as possible in all our environments, not just regional and forested landscapes, but also urban environments. We need to make sure we don't weaken clearing regulations, because clearing is actually one of the main problems historically that's led to reduced forest distributions and reduced woodlands throughout Victoria. In parts of Western Victoria, we have less than 3% remaining of the original distribution of some vegetation classes. So that's obviously a key threat, and that's a threat that we still need to keep an eye on. It's still one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss throughout the world. In many more instances now, look to actively manage after a fire event. So first of all, monitor fire effects. Has it been a damaging event? And if it has, what can we do to repair the damage? Some of that will be actively reseeding areas where we haven't had to actively reseed before. So seed is going to be a really important element for restoration works. Seed from trees, seed from understory species, seed from the whole range of plant species, not just rare ones, but also common ones, because we're possibly going to have to be reseeding large areas if we want to maintain forests. And so that means paying attention in all our, across tenures, across state forests, but also regional parks and national parks, looking at where we might need to be actively restoring. And obviously, if we can, suppress fires on really catastrophic or extreme days to reduce the extent of severe fires. I don't think we're going to have any shortage of severe fires, so what we need to do is restrict it as much as possible in the coming years.
Australian trees have adapted over millions of years to live with and even benefit from fire. Could they adapt again to survive these more frequent and severe fires?
I think there's a lot we don't know about the capacity of plants, trees to adapt to changing conditions. So they seem to be pretty tolerant of many things, and I hope that they remain tolerant of what's to come. But at the same time, I'm trying not to imagine whole stands of trees being killed or knocked over or dying from drought. I hope that isn't the case. So I'm both hopeful and then I'm also quite concerned. I think we do need to pay attention to minimise climate change as much as possible, but then also to really actively manage, actively resource, looking after our forests, our woody ecosystems, all ecosystems as much as possible. We can't sort of lock them away. If we're talking about parks, we can't just sort of set and forget. Once you put something into a park, it still needs attention. It's going to need more attention into the future if we want to maintain the ecosystems that we really rely on and enjoy.
Trees are essential to life on this planet. They clean our water supply, create oxygen, regulate the climate, improve our air quality, provide shelter from the elements to smaller plants and animals, supply food to a myriad of other animals, and even stop erosion. They offer health and well-being to humans. Some doctors are even prescribing patients spend time in forests to reduce stress, anxiety, depression, even high blood pressure. Every single one of us are linked to trees. We need them, just like the mountain pygmy possum is inextricably linked to the bogong moth. As the impacts of climate change are increasingly upon us, we have an urgent need to tackle threats to nature on 3 timescales. The first is to respond to the current and sudden impacts or natural disasters like the Black Summer bushfires. The second timescale is to best prepare for imminent or likely impacts, those things coming soon. And the third is to consider how we can best help nature over the longer term. The needs of wildlife and nature, including those of the most vulnerable species and all ecosystems, are at the core of our efforts. This means we have to act, and we are.
We've lost the last 20,000 years worth of culture and heritage probably. We now have Aboriginal sites that were recorded in the 1980s that are close to 400 or 500 metres out to sea now. They're gone.
In coming episodes, we'll look at the impacts of climate change through an Aboriginal cultural lens, how we push back against the compounding pressures of introduced pests and weeds, how people and nature do and should interact, and how we can shift our thinking to acknowledge these threats while actively and positively helping nature across all species and habitats. Thanks for listening to Closer to Nature. I'm Mark Norman, and thanks to my guests, Ranger Program Coordinator Elaine Thomas from the Victorian Alps and Associate Professor Elaine Bennett from the University of Melbourne, for sharing their knowledge with us. Closer to Nature is a Parks Victoria podcast. This episode was produced by Liz McKenzie, Ben Francischelli, Paddy Naughtin, and hosted by me, Dr. Mark Norman. Production and sound design by Laura Brierley Newton from Audiocraft, and production support from Olivia O'Flynn, also from Audiocraft. We'd love to know what you think, so please subscribe to Closer to Nature and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.